Good evening, guys. In the last session, we discussed about in the last session we discussed about Docker Compose. So, can you guys tell me what is the purpose of Docker Compose and why we are going for Docker Compose? Can you guys tell me what is the purpose of Docker Compose and why we are going for Docker Compose? What is Docker Compose? Why we are going for Docker Compose? We learnt Docker Compose, right? So what is the purpose of this Docker Compose? What is the purpose of Docker Compose? So if you want to manage multi-container based applications, we are going for Docker Compose. Docker Compose is a tool. It is a tool which is used to manage multi-container based applications. Right. So in the real time, we are developing our applications by using microservices architecture. So when we go for microservices architecture, multiple APIs will be available. For every API we need to run in a container. So in order to manage all these containers, running a project, running multiple APIs in the multiple containers manually is a difficult task. So to overcome these problems, we are going for Docker Compose. So it is a tool which is used to manage multi-container applications. Docker Compose tool will use one YML file for configurations. All right. So that file name can be anything. So we are going to write that file name as dockercompose.yml. Dockercompose.yml. So when we execute below command like docker compose run up, so it is going to start all the containers which are available in the Docker Compose. So that is what we discussed in the previous sessions, right? So that is what we have discussed in the previous session. So let me go to that Docker nodes. Right. So here we have seen that the Docker Compose right. So here we have seen Docker Compose. In the real world applications, we are developing our applications using microservices architecture. In microservices architecture, several APIs will be available. Every API is a project and it should run in a container. Running multiple containers manually for all the APIs is a difficult job. To solve this problem, Docker Compose came into picture. Right. Docker Compose is a tool which is used to manage multi-container based applications. Using Docker Compose, we can define and deploy multi-container based applications easily. So we'll give the input to the Docker Compose tool using YML file to run the multiple containers. So how many containers you want to run for your application? Those things can be configured by using this YML. In this YML, we are going to configure version details. We are going to configure services details. We'll configure network details. We'll configure volumes details. Docker Compose default file name will be docker-compose.yml. We can create and start the containers by using Docker Compose up command. See list of containers by using Docker Compose ps. Stop and remove all the containers by using Docker Compose down. Docker Compose images option available. And if you have a different file name, you can use Docker Compose-f with that file name. How to set up the Docker Compose also we discussed in the previous session. Then we have taken one Docker Compose file to run our application with two containers. I want to set up one WordPress website. So for that WordPress website image I'm taking, and I need MySQL database to set up that WordPress website. So generally for MySQL, we need to create one Docker file, and for WordPress, we need to create one Docker file. Instead of that, I'm configuring both containers details in the single YML, that is by using Docker Compose YML. right? So once this Docker Compose YML is available, I'm running that compose file by using Docker Compose up command. It is going to run both containers, MySQL container as well as WordPress container. Okay, so now here some commands I have given which we can use to perform our application build and deployment by using this Docker Compose. Fine, guys. Now, for example, if I want to deploy Docker Compose application with the Spring Boot, a Spring Boot with MySQL using Docker Compose, Spring Boot application with a MySQL DB using Docker Compose, using Docker Compose. We have done that for WordPress and MySQL. If I want to do this same thing for Spring Boot application with a MySQL database using Docker Compose, what are the changes that we need to do? How to write the Docker Compose file? So let's see here what we need to do for this. Let's see here what we need to do for this. First, we need to write a Docker file. So how to write a Docker file from OpenJDK, from OpenJDK. So JDK 1.8 something like that. I'm going to specify from keyword we are going to use for the Spring Boot application. First, I want to write the Docker file. Okay, so my application is dependent on MySQL. So I want to run one container for Spring Boot application, and I want to run one container for MySQL database. So DB container, this is MySQL container, and this is Spring Boot application container. So this is my boot application container. Okay, boot application container is dependent on MySQL container. So I want to run one Spring Boot application. The Spring Boot application is using MySQL database. Spring Boot application is using MySQL database. So how to manage this? How to manage this? Guys, are you getting my point? So can you guys write the Docker file for the Spring Boot application? Can you send me? Can you guys write the Docker file for Spring Boot application? Can you send me? Guys, can you write a Docker file for the Spring Boot application and can you send me that file? I want to see that how you will write the Docker file for Spring Boot application. Can you guys write the Docker file for the Spring Boot application and can you share that? First, we are going to use from OpenJDK. From OpenJDK. So after the from, then we are going to specify copy option. What is the purpose of copy? We have target folder. In the target folder, Spring Boot application, Spring Boot app dot jar file is available. Copy that jar file to this location /user /local, something like this. I'm going to specify sbapp.jar. Okay, so here first I'm using from is used to specify the base image. So in order to run this Spring Boot application, we need to have the Java. So after this, Spring Boot application will be available in the jar file format. Jar file will be available in the target folder. I want to copy the jar file from the target folder to my container machine user local sbapp.jar. Once it has done this, once it has done that, now we need to change the work dir. So we'll go for /user /local /user/local. So we are going to do this work dir configuration. Once the work dir configuration is completed, then what we need to do, guys, I changed the work directory. Once the work directory is changed, then what is the next step that we need to do? What is the next step we need to do? Guys, what is the next step we need to do? Once this work dir changed, once the work dir changed, now I can specify expose. So expose is 8080. What is the purpose of expose command? What is the purpose of expose command? Expose command is used to specify on which port number the application container is going to execute. After this, I want to run the Spring Boot application. Spring Boot applications we are going to execute as a jar file. So for that we are going to use entry point. For that we are going to use entry point. In the entry point we are going to specify Java, comma, -jar, comma. I'm going to specify jar file name sb app.jar file. So it is going to run this jar file. So this will be called as this will be Docker file for Spring Boot applications. Docker file for Spring Boot application. So are you guys able to understand how I am writing this Docker file for Spring Boot application? From keyword I am using, from is used to specify base image which is required for our application. Docker application, Spring Boot applications will be packaged as a jar file. So I'm going to copy the jar file from the target location to my container machine. Then work directory, as the jar file is copied to this location, I want to go to that location by using work dir. Spring Boot applications will use Apache Tomcat by default. So I'm exposing that port number as 8080. It is just a documentation purpose. I'm telling that my application will be running on the port 8080. So as the jar file is copied, we need to execute that jar. In order to execute that jar, we are going to use entry point. So entry point instructions will be executed while creating the container. We can't override. Same thing we can execute by using CMD also. CMD instructions also CMD instructions also will be executed at the time of container creation, but the CMD instructions will be executed. CMD instructions will be executed at the time of container creation, but we can override the CMD instructions, whereas entry point instructions we cannot override. Entry point instructions we cannot override. Are you guys clear with my point? Are you guys clear with my point? Are you guys clear with my point? How to write a Docker file for this one? Are you guys clear with the Docker file for this one? Yes. So in this Docker file, I'm telling that only Spring Boot application related configuration is available. So to run the Spring Boot application, to run Spring Boot applications, we will use below Docker file. We will use below Docker file. So what we are doing in this one? We are just specifying the base image, and we are specifying work directory, and we are specifying port number exposing, and we are specifying entry point. For Spring Boot application, we need MySQL database. For Spring Boot application, in Spring Boot application, we are using MySQL database. If we are using MySQL database, MySQL DB for Spring Boot, if we are using MySQL DB in Spring Boot application, then we need to run MySQL DB in a container. We need to run MySQL DB in a container. So one container we need to use for the boot application, and one container we need to use for the MySQL database. So running both containers manually and managing both containers is a difficult process. So here today we have only 2 containers to execute, but in future, today we have only 2 containers to execute, but in future we may have multiple containers. So managing multiple containers manually is a difficult job. So in order to overcome that problem, what we are going to do, Docker Compose. So instead of managing these two containers separately, note, instead of managing two containers separately, we can use Docker Compose. So what is the purpose of Docker Compose? It is used to manage multi-container application. Docker Compose will use one YML file for the configurations. That is Docker Compose.yml. So Docker Compose configuration. Okay. So when we go for Docker Compose configuration, that file name will be available as Docker Compose.yml. We are going to use the file name as Docker Compose.yml. What will be available in the Docker Compose? Version will be available, and services will be available, and network will be available, and volumes will be available. So like this, we need to take our Docker Compose file. So this Docker Compose.yml file contains the configuration to run multiple containers required for my application. So here for Spring Boot application, already Docker file is created. Now here Docker file, it is created. Now we need to manage the MySQL database. So instead of running that in a separate container, I'm going to use Compose. So in the Compose, we need to write this configuration. So what configuration we need to write in the Compose file so that we can manage multiple containers which are required for our application. Okay. What is the configuration we need to do for this? Guys, now, any idea how to write a Docker Compose? Do you have any idea how to write a Docker Compose file? First, we are going to specify version. So which version we are using? So for example, I'm going to use version 3. Next one, services, network, and volumes. So services means what are the containers that you want to run for your application. Network concept currently we don't know. Right? And volumes will be available. Volumes is used to store the data permanently. Got it. So currently I'm not going to take the volumes also for this one. Services. So here services we can specify multiple. How many services we need? Two services I need. What are those two services? One is Spring Boot app. This is one service, and another service is MySQL DB. So Spring Boot application I want to run as one container. MySQL database I want to run as one container. So how many containers you want to run for your application? You need to specify them under services. Now, so inside the Spring Boot application, I need to specify what is the image name. So I'm going to specify my image name as boot app. Suppose for example, this service name I'm giving as a boot application. This service name I'm giving as a MySQL DB. So what is the image name? So image name I am giving as ESB REST API. That is the name of the image I am using. Next one, ports. So I want to map this Spring Boot application to a port number. So here host machine port number I am going to use as 8080, and container port number is also 8080. Host machine port number I want to specify as 8080. Now here I'm going to specify depends on. This depends on another image. What is that another image it is dependent on? It is dependent on MySQL DB. So this is one container. So in this Compose file, I'm specifying services. Boot application should run as one container. MySQL database should run as one container. For boot application, the image we created is the SB REST API, and the port mapping I'm doing with 8080. So this is container port number. This is host port number. Depends on. So in order to create the container for the boot application. First, it should create the container for the MySQL DB. For MySQL DB, what is the image name? I'm going to take the image name as MySQL colon some 8. I want to download MySQL image from the central hub of the Docker, right? Image name I'm getting. Image name I'm getting. Next one, environment. Environment. So for MySQL root password, we need to specify. So for this database, password will be available. MySQL root password. MySQL root password will be available. Root password is equal to root. The password will be root by default. And MySQL database, I have to specify MySQL database. MySQL database. You can give any database name. I'm giving the database name as bootdb. I'm giving the database name as a bootdb. So this is going to be our Docker Compose configuration for our boot application. Are you guys able to understand how to write a Docker Compose file for multi-containers? Are you guys able to understand? Are you guys able to understand how to write the compose? Is my voice audible, guys? Is my voice audible for everybody? Yes, right. Now here we need to specify which version that we are using. What is the version? You can keep any version. I'm keeping 3 as a version. Then services. So what are the services you want to manage by using this Docker Compose? I want to manage 2 services. One is boot application. Another one is MySQL. That is a version for the file that we are writing. That's it. Okay. Next one. How many services we want to manage with our application that we are going by using Docker Compose? How many services we want to manage? I want to manage boot application as one container, and I want to manage MySQL database as one container. So I'm configuring MySQL DB. So for MySQL DB image name, I'm specifying as MySQL colon 8. That means MySQL 8th version I want to download, and I want to run the MySQL database in a container. For that MySQL database, default username will be root, and password you can set up. So I'm giving the password as root only, or you can give any password also for the database. Then MySQL database name I'm giving as a bootdb. This database name can be anything. Project name can be used as a database name. So this is MySQL DB container configuration. So MySQL database will run as one container, and boot application will run as one container. For the boot application image name, I'm specifying as SB REST API. Port number I'm also port number also I'm mapping. Container Spring Boot application will run on the Tomcat server. Tomcat server port number will be 8080. That port number I am mapping to host port number 8080. So whenever the boot application image is using to create the container, I'm telling that this boot application container, it depends upon the MySQL DB container. So MySQL DB container will be created, then boot application container will be created. Are you guys able to understand the configuration? Are you guys able to understand this configuration? Yeah, image name that we are going to specify in the Docker file as a from, same thing here. So now when you want to manage these 2 containers, how many files will be available for your project now? 2 files will be available for our project. One is a Docker file, another one is the Docker Compose file. Clear, guys? How to do the Docker Compose for Spring Boot with MySQL? In the previous session, we have done the Docker Compose for WordPress and MySQL. So today, we have done the configuration for Spring Boot application with MySQL. This is the Docker file for the Spring Boot application, and this is the Docker Compose file to manage multiple containers. Okay, so this application we are going to execute after discussing networking concept, guys. So when we are going for this Docker Compose related to manage multiple containers, we need to have some knowledge related to Docker network. So let's understand what is the Docker network. So once we understand the Docker network concept, then practically we are going to implement this Spring Boot application with MySQL database. I will give the source code of the Spring Boot application, which will use MySQL, so that you can write the Docker file and you can write the Docker Compose file, and we can manage that application by using Docker, by using networking concept. Docker networking concept we need to understand. So let us start discussion related to what is this Docker network and why we need to go for this Docker network. What is the Docker network and why we need to go for this Docker network? Let's try to understand that part. Now, first of all, what is the meaning of networking? Networking is about communication among the processes. Networking means communication among processes. So now, if you want to connect from one machine to another machine, we are going to use internet, right? How we are going to connect from one machine to another machine? How we are going to communicate from one machine to another machine? By using networking. So internet connection is mandatory if you want to connect from one machine to another machine. Okay, right here, if you want to set up a network for a Docker container, then we are going to use Docker networking concept. Docker networking enables a user to link a Docker container to as many networks as they require. Container to as many networks as they require. Right now I am running multiple containers. So here, this is boot application container and this is MySQL container. So there should be some connection between this application container to MySQL container because my application want to communicate with the database. If one container wants to connect with the another container, there should be some communication. How to establish communication from one container to another container? That's where Docker network concept comes into picture. Networking is all about communication among the processes. Docker networking enables a user to link a Docker container to as many networks as they require. Now, Docker networks are used to provide complete isolation for Docker containers. Docker network is used to provide complete isolation for Docker containers. So we are going to run multiple containers for our application. One Docker container want to communicate with another Docker container, or I don't want anybody to communicate with my Docker container. My host machine only should communicate with the Docker container, or I want to establish some link between one container to another container. In order to do that operation, we are going to use this Docker networking concept. So simple example, this I have taken. Boot application is available. MySQL container is available. My boot application running in one container. MySQL database running in another container. Boot application wants to talk to database. So there should be some link. There should be some connection between the boot container and the MySQL container. So for that, we are going to use Docker network concept. We can establish the link from one container to another container by using this Docker networking concept. By using this Docker networking concept, we can provide complete isolation for Docker containers. If you want to establish the connection, you can do that. If you don't want, or you can ignore that. What are the advantages of the Docker networking? Advantages of Docker networking. Why we need to go for this Docker networking concept? What are the advantages? Right? Docker containers shares. They share single operating system. Multiple containers are running in the same machine. They share single operating system and maintains containers in an isolated manner. Every container will be executing separately. In the same machine. In one operating system, multiple containers we are going to execute. By using this networking concept, we can set up isolated network for Docker containers. Okay. This networking helps us in doing application portability. It requires fewer OS instances to run the workload. It requires fewer OS instances to share or to run the workload. And the next one is it helps in the fast delivery of the software. It helps in fast delivery of the software. It helps in application portability. It helps in application portability. So easily we can run our applications in multiple machines. So applications will have a portability and isolated network will be available. And we can establish the communication from one container to another container by using this networking concept, because we are developing applications with microservices architecture. Multiple APIs will be available, then multiple containers will be available. When we are running these containers, there should be some communication. To establish the communication, we are using Docker network, right? When the Docker is installed, in our machine, we are installing the Docker software and we are running. So when Docker is installed, three different Docker networks will be configured by default. When Docker is installed in a machine, by default, three Docker networks will be configured. By default, three Docker networks will be configured. So what are those three different networks by default it is going to configure? One is none, second one is host, third one is bridge. Host network, bridge network, no network. When the Docker software is installed in any machine, by default, three Docker networks will be configured. What are those three networks? One is none, second one is host, and the third one is bridge, like this. Okay. Now here, the bridge network can be configured, known as Docker 0 network. The none and host are important components of the Docker stack and cannot be removed. The bridge network will be the default network that is going to available for our application. Docker can be used for creating many networks. You can add the containers to more than one network. A container is attached to multiple networks, can connect with a containers, right? We can attach a container to a network. One container we can attach to multiple containers also. One container we can attach to multiple networks. When container is attached to multiple networks, the containers can intercommunicate. When container is attached to multiple networks, then those containers can communicate. So whenever we install Docker software, by default we are going to get three Docker networks. None will be available, bridge will be available, host will be available. One container we can attach to multiple networks. When container is attached to multiple networks, then those containers can be communicated. Okay, so Docker supports networking for its containers using network drivers. So how this networking is happening? How this network is happening in our Docker machine? How this one container can communicate with another container? How the connections are happening? Docker providing network for containers using network drivers. Docker providing networking to containers using network drivers. So network drivers are available. Docker network drivers. There are several drivers available in the Docker to establish networking for the containers. Docker network drivers. So what are the network drivers available in the Docker? Below are the drivers. One is bridge driver. Second one is host driver. Third one is none driver. Those are by default will come. And the fourth one is overlay driver. And the fifth one is Macmillan driver. So these are the networking drivers used by the Docker to provide networking for the containers. When the container is started, we have Docker image. So if you go to the Docker workflow, we are going to create a Docker file. We are going to create a Docker file. From the Docker file, we are going to build a Docker image. We are going to build a Docker image. From that Docker image, we are going to create containers. So we can create containers in multiple machines. We can run that image in multiple machines. Those containers are going to execute. So this is our Docker file. This is our Docker file. Using this Docker file, we are going to build Docker image. That image we are going to execute. We are going to execute, then containers are going to start. Container is the runtime instance of a image. Image is a package which contain the application and application configurations. Container 1, container 2, like this, container 3. We can run these containers. So here it is going to happen build process. From the Docker file, we are going to build the image. That image we are going to execute. When we run this image, containers will be created. Okay, when these containers are created, by default, Docker will provide networking for these containers. Okay, how the Docker is providing networking for the containers? Docker providing networking to the containers by using network drivers. There are network drivers available. What are the network drivers available? Bridge driver available, host driver available, none driver, overlay driver, Macmillan driver, like that. There are different networking drivers available in the Docker. By using these drivers only, Docker is providing networking for the containers. So in the interview, they will ask you, what are these drivers? What are these drivers? Okay, so here, bridge driver, this is the private default network created on the host by the Docker. This is the default driver that we are going to get when we run a Docker container. Right. So bridge drivers are very useful when the application is executed in the standalone container. Bridge driver. This is the default. This is the default network driver. This is the default network driver created on the Docker host machine. Whenever you install Docker software, by default, this bridge driver will be created on the host machine. Are you guys clear with my point? Bridge network drivers are very important, are very useful when the application is executing in a standalone container. Right. When the application is running in the standalone container, then these bridge network drivers are very useful. Bridge network drivers are very useful when application running in standalone container. Only one container which we are executing. For executing the application in only one container, standalone container, then bridge drivers are very useful. Bridge drivers are very useful. We can see the information of the bridge driver by using Docker network inspect command. We can see more details about bridge driver using below command. We can execute one command, that is Docker network inspect bridge. So if you execute this command, it is going to give you more details about Docker bridge. Docker network inspect bridge. Now can you see? It is providing the information. The name of the driver is a bridge. It is ID, created date, scope, IPM details, subway, subnet, gateway. These are already associated with that. So networking will be available. In the AWS, we discussed about VPC subnets and internet gateways, right? For this bridge driver, whenever we install the Docker software, by default, this bridge driver will be created on the machine where you install the Docker. For this bridge driver, subnet and gateway is already associated, and this is very useful when we are running our application in standalone containers. This is the default driver that will be provided by the Docker to establish networking for the containers. So when you run a container, by default, they will use this bridge driver. Are you guys clear with my point? Next one is host driver. Host driver is available. host driver is also available. Host drivers. So when we go for a host driver, it is also used to run the standalone containers. If this host networking is enabled for the container, the link between the isolation between the Docker host and the network stack will be removed. Container does not get any will not get any allocated IP addresses. It is useful. It is useful when standalone containers are executing for our application. It is useful when standalone containers are getting executed. When standalone container is available. When the standalone container is available, we can go for that. Are you guys clear with my point? Host driver, bridge driver is available, host driver is available. So what is the default driver that we are going to get for our containers? The default one is a bridge driver, or the default one is a host driver. The default one is a bridge driver. So that is the default network driver created on the Docker host machine. Whenever you run any container, by default it is going to run with the bridge driver. So if you want, you can specify host driver. You can specify host driver. So here it is not going to allocate any IP address. The container will not get container will not get any IP address when we enable host driver. Generally, whenever you run a Docker image, container will be created. For the container, one IP address will be created. When you enable host driver, that IP address will not be available. For example, a container is executed. Suppose, for example, a container is executed that binds to port 80. I'm executing Nginx web package. Nginx web package will be starting on the port number 80. HTTPD or Nginx we can use. It is going to run on the port number 80, and the host networking is used. For example, a container is executed that binds to port 80 with a host network driver. In this case, we no need to map container port to host machine port. By default it will be available. The networking mode is useful. This is very useful when we are dealing with large number of ports in our containers. This is useful when we are running our containers with large number of ports. Suppose when you are running a container will be running on one port number. That port number we need to map with our host machine port number. Then only we can access that application by using our host machine IP address. If you specify host driver, the network link will be removed between the host machine and the container. So whatever the port is available for the container, with the same port you can access that in the host machine also. You no need to map the port numbers when you use this host driver. This host driver is also useful when we are going for standalone applications. So there will not be any link between the host machine and the Docker containers with this host driver. So if your container is running on the port number 80, then directly that application can be accessible on the host machine also with the same port number. You don't need to do any mapping. So when we need to use this, my container is dealing with a large number of ports. When the container is dealing with a large number of ports, then you can go for host driver. Next one is none driver. None driver means nothing. No network will be available for the drivers. Bridge driver will be available, host driver will be available, none driver will be available. These are the three drivers will come by default when you install Docker. None. This is used for in this type of network. The containers will have no access to external networks and are not attached to other containers or networks. Non-driver means no networking. In this type of network, the containers have no access to external networks. Networking concept will not be available when you use this non-driver. Okay. Right. Next one, overlay driver is available. So overlay driver, this will be used when we are going for Docker Swarm. I want to scale my Docker containers. I want to do the auto scaling kind of concept for my Docker containers. Then we are going to use Docker Spam. Okay. This is used for creating internal private network spanning across all the nodes in the Swarm cluster. We will use Docker Swarm to orchestrate our Docker containers. Overlay driver will be used. Overlay driver will be used when we have Docker Swarm cluster. So currently we did not discuss about Docker Swarm. That is our tomorrow's topic. So when we discuss Docker Swarm, then I'm going to tell you what is this overlay driver and how we are going to use this cluster and why we need to go for Docker Swarm. When the Docker Swarm is used, how we are going to use this overlay driver for that. And the next one is MacVLAN driver. The last driver that is available in the Docker is MacVLAN driver. So when you go for MacVLAN driver, this Docker network will assign a MAC address for that. A MAC address will be assigned for this. This network driver will assign a MAC address to a container. A separate unique address will be assigned for a container. That address is called as a MAC address. Okay. MacVLAN driver is available. This network driver will assign a MAC address to a container. This makes it appear as a physical device. MAC address will make our container as a physical device. This MAC address will make our device as physical appearance. So you can see the physical address. Physical address will be assigned for container when you go for this MacVLAN driver. Using this MAC address, the Docker daemon, that means the Docker engine, we can say the Docker engine or Docker daemon. Docker daemon routes the traffic to a particular router. So which request we are going to sending, how to route that request. It is going to route the request based on the MAC address. When the MAC address is assigned for a driver, we can consider that as a physical device. MacVLAN network simplifies communication between the containers. When you use MacVLAN driver simplifies communication between containers, because every container will have a MAC address. A unique ID will be available for every container. Using that we can easily set up the communication from one container to another container. All right. So guys, total how many network drivers are available and what is the purpose of these network drivers? We are going to run our application with multiple containers. When we are running our application with multiple containers, there should be some communication between one container to another container. So in order to establish the communication from one container to another container, we are going to use Docker networking concept. How the Docker is providing networking for our containers? Docker is providing networking to containers by using network drivers. So there are multiple network drivers are available in the Docker. So what are those drivers? One is bridge driver, second one is host driver, third one is none driver, fourth one is overlay driver, fifth one is Macmillan driver. Whenever you install the Docker software, by default, three drivers will be created: bridge driver, host driver, none driver. And if you want, you can use the remaining two drivers also. Bridge driver is the default private network driver used by the Docker to run our container. Using this bridge driver only, it is establishing the connection between the host machine and the Docker container. Host machine means the computer in the machine where we are installing and running the Docker. That is a host machine. So there will be a communication between the host machine and the Docker container because it is using by default bridge driver. Okay, so here host driver can be used. So the communication link will be removed. Then port mappings directly you can use it when you go for host driver. None driver means it will not have, that container will not have any connection to external networks when you go for none driver. Overlay driver, when we are going to use Docker Swarm, that means I want to scale my application. I want to scale my application. I want to run my containers with a cluster concept. Then we can go for overlay driver. Macmillan will be available. So if you want to assign a unique address for every container, if you want to simplify the communication between the containers, then we can go for this Macmillan driver. So like that, there are 5 drivers are available. Now, how to work with this Docker networking drivers? So there are some commands available. So we need to understand how to work with these commands. Working with Docker networking commands. Working with Docker networking commands. So if you want to see what all the drivers that are available, what all the networks that are available, we can see that in our machine. First, let's go for Docker network ls. Docker network ls. Can you see which drivers are available by default? Bridge driver is available. EC2 user default is available. That is also a bridge, and host driver available. Null is available. Bridge driver, host driver, null, nothing but none. So by default, when you install the Docker, you are going to get 3 drivers: bridge driver, host driver, none driver. None driver is nothing but null driver. Right. Now, how to run one Docker container? Okay, so let me take one example. Docker run --name nginx. I'm taking as a driver the container name. So I want to run nginx image. Nginx is a default image, guys. We can see Docker pull nginx. I'm pulling nginx image. So nginx is the official image. I'm pulling from Docker Hub. So here, once I pulled it, I can see Docker images. When I see the Docker images, you can see MySQL image available, WordPress image available, Nginx image is also available. Now, I want to run this Nginx image. In order to run the Nginx image, I'm using Docker run command. Image already pulled from the Docker Hub to my local host machine. Host machine means in which machine the Docker is running. That is called host machine. I pulled Nginx image to my host machine, my image available locally. Now I want to run this image. So in order to run the image, we are going to use Docker run. Container name, I'm specifying it as Nginx only, and -d for detached mode, -p port mapping 80:80. Nginx is a web package. It will run on the port number 80. That port number only I want to map by my host also. 80:80 I am using, and image name I am using. Yes, Nginx image started. Whenever you start a image, whenever you run a image, it is going to create a container, and it is going to attach that container to a network. It is going to attach that container to a network. Now, once this Nginx image started as a Docker container, access this public IP, go to the browser, access it. Are we able to access Nginx server, which is running in the Docker container? Are we accessing the container directly? Or we are accessing the EC2 VM IP address? Guys, in this scenario, are we accessing the Docker container directly, or we are accessing EC2 instance? Come on, guys. Can you tell me? We are accessing the Docker container directly, or we are accessing the EC2 machine public IP? EC2 public IP. When I access the EC2 public IP, how it is connected to that container? So there is a communication between the host machine and the Docker container or not? Through network. So which network it used directly? Which network it will use by default when we run a container? Which network? Host network or bridge network? What is the default network will be used by the Docker? Bridge network. What is the default network, guys? By default network it is using as a bridge network. So bridge network is already available. Did I create a bridge network, or it is by default available in the Docker? Did I create this bridge network, or it is by default available? It is by default available. So whenever you run a container, whenever you run a image, Docker will provide bridge network for that container, and using that bridge network, our host machine will communicate with the Docker container. All right. Now here, instead of running this container directly, can I specify that use bridge network? Yes, we can also specify to use bridge network. Are you guys clear with my point? We can also specify that use bridge network. We can create our network and we can specify that use bridge network. Are you guys able to understand my point? Now, how to create our own network? Okay, first thing is list all the networks. To list all networks, we are going to use a command called docker network ls. Docker network ls. Okay, now here we are running nginx image, right? Let's inspect that image. Docker inspect nginx. Docker inspect nginx. Now, can you see whenever I inspect that Docker container, can you see this in the networking settings? Can you see it is using which networks, which network it is using? Nginx container is running, right? That Nginx container is connected to which network by default? Bridge network. So did I specify that use bridge network, or is the default by default provided by Docker? By default it provided by Docker, that is using default bridge network. Okay, now I want to run this Docker container. Okay, how we are running the container? Running Docker container with the default network. Running Docker container with the default network. You don't need to do any setting for this. Docker will take care of that. Docker run -name nginx. I'm taking -d -p 80:80 and image name I specified. Once you have done that, Docker inspect nginx. So here I'm checking what all the networks available. Here I'm running a container without specifying the network driver. By just my image is available. I want to run that image. When I run this nginx image, by default it attach it to bridge driver. By default it attach it to bridge driver. Are you guys clear with my point? Creating our own bridge network. Creating our own bridge network. How can we create our own bridge network? So here we can use Docker network create driver name. I'm specifying my driver name as bridge driver. I'm specifying my network name as my network. Are you guys clear with this? How to create our own network in the Docker? Are you able to understand how to create our own network in the Docker? Docker network create, specify the driver as a bridge driver and give the network name, my network. You can give any name. You can give your project name also. Docker network create driver bridge network. Now let us see how I'm going to create. Before going to create, let us check it once. Docker network ls. Guys, can you see, is there any network available with a name called my network currently? Is there any network available with a name called my network currently in the Docker? Not available. Now I want to create my own network in the Docker. I want to create my own network in the Docker. Docker network create. I'm going to specify driver. Driver, which driver? Bridge driver I want to use. You can create a host driver or you can create a bridge driver. I'm creating bridge driver. With the bridge driver, I'm creating my network with a name called my network. Docker network create my network. I want to create my own network in the Docker by using bridge driver. Yes, it created. Now Docker network ls. Can you see that? My network is created using bridge driver. Can we create our own network in the Docker? Can we create our own network in the Docker? Can we create our own network in the Docker? Yes. So what is the command we are using to create our own network in the Docker? Docker network command I'm using, create option. I'm specifying the driver as bridge my network. If we don't specify the driver, by default it will take which driver? If we don't specify driver, then by default it will take bridge driver because it is the default driver. Now run a container, run the Docker container using custom network. Run the Docker container, using custom network which we have created. Already my network is created with a name called my network. Now I want to run the Docker container by using the network which we have created. How to run this? Now we are going to use Docker run command -name. You can give a name for this, Nginx 20. I'm giving the Docker container name as Nginx 20. You can give any name for that. -d -network. The network is my network, and I'm going to specify the port number as some 7070:80 port mapping. I'm doing port mapping 7070:80, and Nginx is the name of the image. Can you see? Am I using a network to run my container? Am I using my network to run my container, guys? My network is the name of the network. Here I have created that network. Docker network create driver as a bridge, create my network. So why I am creating my own network? When multiple containers are there, for Spring Boot application is available, MySQL application is available, MySQL container available, Spring Boot container available. I want to establish communication between these two containers. If I want to establish the communication between these two containers, some network driver is required. So for that, I created my own network in the Docker by using bridge driver. Now how to attach a container to a particular, how to run the container by using our own network? So this is the command, Docker run name Nginx 20 I am using, -d detached mode -network. Here I'm specifying the network name to run the container. -p port mapping. Container Nginx container will run on the port number 80. In the host machine, I want to bind it to 7070, and I want to use Nginx is the image name. Now take this command and execute. Remember, container name I am giving as Nginx 20. Container name I am giving as Nginx 20. Yes, it started. Now go for Docker PS containers are running. A container name is Nginx 20 that I am going to use that. Clear. Docker network ELS. My network is available. Docker inspect my network. Docker network inspect my network. See here, container is attached to that network or not. Docker network inspect my network. Now, currently in this Docker network inspect my network, I want to see the network which I have created. So I am doing the inspection of my network. When I see that, can you see container is attached to this network? Can you see the container Nginx 20 is attached to the my network now? Can you see that information? Is Nginx 20 image attached to my network or not? Guys, come on. Nginx is attached to the my network or not? Yes. How I attached this Nginx image to my network? Docker run name Nginx 20 I am using. Network I'm specifying. Network as my network. This Docker container is going to start by using my network. My network is a custom network we created by using bridge driver. Are you guys clear? Once we have done this, inspect, check the container attached to the Docker network. Check the containers attached to my network. Using which command? Docker network inspect my network. If you execute this command, it is going to display which containers are attached to your network. If you execute this command, it is going to display which containers are attached to your network. Are you guys able to understand this point? Are you guys able to understand this point now? Okay. Yes, with this we understood. Now I want to do one exercise, guys. So what I want to do is, I want to check it really the communication is happening between the two containers or not. I want to create one container and another container. So let me take it as Nginx 30 container, Nginx 31 container, Nginx 30 container, Nginx 31 container. Okay, so both containers will be attached to my network. Both containers I'm going to attach with my network. I'm going to create one network. Both containers I want to attach with my network. Once I attach these both containers to my network, ping Nginx 31 from container Nginx 30. Ping Nginx 31 from container Nginx 30. Now here what I want to do is ping Nginx 30 from Nginx 31, reverse both. So two containers I'm going to launch. Container name, first container name I'm going to give as Nginx 30 container, and the second container name I'm going to give as Nginx 31 container. Two containers I'm going to create. Both containers will be attached to single network, which is my network. Once these two containers are attached to single network, then I want to ping one container from the another container. If both are really connected through the network, then we should be able to ping one container from the another container. If you are able to ping one container from the another container, that means our network concept is working. Are you clear with my scenario? Are you guys clear with my scenario, guys? Are you guys clear with my scenario? Can we do that now? Yes. Docker ps-a. So there are multiple containers available. I want to kill all these running containers at a time. Remove all the containers which are running. Yes, all the containers got stopped. Docker ps-a. No container is available. No container is available. Now I want to run two containers, guys. So observe carefully. What is the process I'm going to do? Docker, run the two containers and ping each container from the other container. Run two Docker containers using my network, and check connectivity between two containers using ping command. Okay, so this is the first container that I am going to run, Nginx 30. Docker run Nginx 30 I'm using. So this one I am mapping to a port number called, this one I'm mapping to a port number called 8080. Nginx 30 image, Nginx 30 container I am running. So I'm specifying the network as a my network only. Copy this command, go here, execute. I'm binding this container to my network. Container name I am giving as Nginx 30. Port mapping also I'm doing. Yes, one container started. Now let's run another container. This container name I'm giving as 31. This port I am mapping to 9090. This is going to run the container as with a name called 30. This is going to run another container with a name as 31. Port numbers also different mapping. Right. Two containers started. Can we check that? Docker ps. Can you guys see two containers are running, guys? Two containers are running. Now I want to ping one container from another container. If you want to ping one container from the another container, first of all, we need to get the container IP address. First, we need to get the container IP address. So how to get the container IP address? Two containers are running in my machine now. So here, two containers are running in my host machine. Two containers are running in my host machine. Right, guys. So this is the task that we need to do. This is the task we need to do. Two containers are running in my host machine. So this is my host machine. Two containers are running in the host machine. I want to understand IP addresses of these two containers. I want to understand IP addresses for these two containers. So 30th container IP address, 31st container IP address I want to get. Nginx 30, Nginx 31. What is the IP address of Nginx 30 and what is the IP address of Nginx 31? How to get that IP address? How to get that IP address? So let me write a command. Let me write a command to get that IP address. Okay. Can you guys check in the Google and tell me how can we get the IP address of a container? Right, guys. So what is the command that we need to use to get IP address? So if you use Docker PS, it will just display the container details, right? Is it displaying the IP address? Is it displaying the IP address? Is it displaying the IP address when you run the Docker PS? It is just displaying it is just going to display you what are the containers running, what is the name of the container, what is the ID. But I want to get the IP address. I want to get the IP address. So to get the IP address, so we need to execute below command. Get the IP address of Docker containers. Get IP address of Docker container. In order to get the IP address of a Docker container, so what is the command we need to write? Docker inspect -f, a big command we need to write, guys. So here range dot network settings, range dot network settings dot networks. Okay, Docker inspect -f, range dot network settings dot networks, then dot IP addresses dot IP addresses dot IP address. Then we are going to specify end. Then we need to specify our container ID or name. So this command is going to give you the IP address of Docker container. Syntax. This is the syntax we need to follow. Now let me execute this command. Let me execute this command. My container ID or container name, I'm going to give my container name as Nginx 30. Am I able to get the ID of 30 and 31? So what is the IP address of Nginx 30? Nginx 30 IP address is this. Let me keep like that. This is the IP address of Nginx 30 and this is the IP address of Nginx 31. Are we able to get IP address of a Docker container by using inspect command? Are we able to get IP address? Are we able to get IP address? Guys, come on. Right. So once we got this IP address, then how can we connect to that particular container and how to ping them? So in order to connect to a particular container, I'm going to execute Docker exec -it interactive mode, then container name nginx 30/bin/bash. Now I connected. Once I connected to this, now I want to ping. I connected to 30th container. Let's ping 172.19.0.3. It is saying that ping is not found. Guys, you see here my commands. I get the IP address of the Nginx 30 container, which is 02. Now I got the another container IP address I'm getting Nginx 31. That IP address is 03. Once I got these two IP addresses, now I want to connect to Nginx 30 and I want to ping 31 IP. Right. In order to connect it to the 30th container in the interactive mode, I'm using Docker exe command -it interactive mode nginx 30 bin bash. Now I connected. I connected to 30th container. From this 30th container, I'm trying to ping the IP address of the 31st container. But ping is failed. Why? Because ping command is not available by default. Let's install the ping command. Yapt get update. Yapt get update. I'm updating these packages. Once it is updated, then I am going to install ping command. How to install the ping command? Yapt get install iputils-ping. I'm going to download it. I have downloaded. Once it is downloaded, now I want to ping them. How to ping them? Ping 172.0.0.3. Am I able to ping? Am I able to ping, guys? Is it successful? Is my ping successful or not? Yes, ping is successful. Yes, 56 bytes of data we got. That means ping successful. Okay, come out. Exit. Exit. Now let's execute. Now let's execute this command. Let's connect to 31st container. Let's connect it to 31st container. I connected. In the 31st container, let's ping 172.0.0.2. Ping is not working. So how to install the ping? Yapt get update. In the second container, I am installing the ping command. Then yapt get install iputils-ping. I'm installing that ping. Once the installation is completed, now ping it. Am I able to ping the from 31st container? Am I able to ping the IP of the 30th container? Yes, we are able to ping it. So both are having a network connection. Are we able to establish the communication from one container to another container by using bridge driver network? Yes, we are able to do that. Yes, we are able to do that. Clear. Fine. Sorry, I gave wrong IP. Oh my God. Guys, 1 second. I tried ping the wrong IP. That IP was not successful ping. Nginx 31st. So Nginx 31st IP address. This is 31st Nginx 30 container IP 172.19.03 Nginx 30 container IP Nginx 30 container IP. Let me get the 30th container IP address 172.19.02 172.19.02. These are the two IP addresses. I got these IP addresses. Now I want to connect it to 30th IP. I want to ping 31st IP container. How to connect it? Can you tell me how to connect it? Docker exec -t nginx 30/bin/bash. Nginx, sorry, space is not there. Yeah, I connected. Now ping. I connected to 30. So let me ping 31st container IP. Now see here, is my ping successful? Am I able to ping IP address of 31st container from the 30th container? Is my ping successful? Is my ping successful, guys? Is my ping successful now? Right. Now let's come out. Let's stop this. Let's stop it. Exit. Zero packet loss. So 27 packets received, zero packet loss. We are able to ping successfully. Exit from this, come out. Now let's connect to 30th container. Then let's ping 31st container IP. Okay, so previously I connected to one container, then I pinged another container. I connected to 30th container, pinged 31. Now let me connect to 31st container. The name is 31. I connected. Now ping IP address of 30. How to ping IP address of 30? Ping IP address of 30th container 172.19.0.2. Let's ping it. Are we able to ping? Are we able to ping? Come on. Yes, we are able to ping. Now connect to here. Connect to Nginx 30 container and ping Nginx 31 container IP. So what are the commands we are going to execute? How to connect to that first? Docker exec -it nginx 30/bin/bash. Once you connected there, then execute apt get update the packages, then apt get install iputils-ping. By default, ping is not available in that container machine, so we are installing ping first. Once we have installed that ping, then we are going to ping that $ping IP address of this. Then same thing we are going to repeat. Connect to Nginx 31 container and ping Nginx 30 container IP. Okay, so here we are going to connect to 31 and we are going to ping to the second one. The ping should be successful. Then only we can say we are able to establish the Docker network successfully. Yeah, guys, so see these commands. Working with networking commands. So to list down all the Docker networks in our host machine, Docker network ls. I'm running a Docker container with the default network, so no need to specify the driver. No need to specify anything. When I run this Nginx image, by default, it is running with bridge driver. Okay, you can check that by inspecting that container. It will show that this container is attached to bridge network. So instead of going for the default network provided by the Docker, we can create our own network also by using Docker network create --driver. Driver name I'm specifying as a bridge, and this is my network name. Network name can be anything. Here, driver name specifying is optional. If you don't specify this driver name, then by default it will take as bridge driver only. Now, how to run a container by using the user defined network we have created? This option we are going to specify. I'm specifying run this container by using my network. Docker run --name nginx 20-d. Nginx 20 is the name of my container. --network, my network I specified. -p, the port I have mapped. Check the containers attached to my network. How can I check it? Docker inspect, Docker network inspect, my network. I have checked it. Run two Docker containers using my network and check the connectivity between two containers using ping command. So here I'm running a container with a name called Nginx 30 and I'm running another container with a name called Nginx 31. How to get the IP address of the Docker containers? So here I'm using Docker inspect-f. So here this is the command I am using. Container ID or name also you can specify to get the IP address. Nginx 30 container IP address I got as this value. Nginx 31st container IP address I got as this value. Now connect to Nginx 30 container and ping Nginx 31 container IP using ping command. How to connect to a particular container machine? Particular container docker exe nginx 30 bin/bash. So now I executed update command. I installed ping. Then I pinged IP of 31 container from the 30. Ping success. Right. Next one, connect to Nginx 31 container and ping Nginx 30 container IP using ping command. So same thing. I connected to 31 container. I installed ping software. Then I pinged IP address of the 30 container from 31. Both pings are successful. So with this, can we say that we are able to create a bridge network and we are able to run the containers using bridge network. We are able to establish communication. We are able to ping from one container to another container. Is it clear for all of you? Is it clear for all of you? Good. Next one, running a container using host network. Running the container using host network. Running containers using host network driver. I used bridge network driver. So that is a default network driver we are going to get. You don't need to specify anything. I'm going to run the containers using host network driver. When we use this host network driver, port mapping is not required. Are you guys clear with this? When we use host network driver, port mapping is not required. Port mapping is not required. Now see here, Docker run --name. I'm going to specify Nginx 35, Nginx 35 network host. I'm going to specify -d Nginx. That's it. In this command, am I specifying any port number? In this command, am I doing any port mapping? Why port mapping is not required? We are using host network driver. So whatever the port the container using, with the same port, it will bind to the host machine. When you use the host driver, you no need to specify port mappings separately. Go to this. Yeah, stop this ping, come out, clear. Now I am going to run this Docker container Nginx 35 using Nginx image using host driver. Are we able to understand how I pinged it? Now access it, access that public IP. Yes, it is accessible. So whenever you use this command, whenever we use this command, we are not giving any port number. If you observe, we are running Nginx container without port mapping, because we are using host network driver. So container port will be used directly in the host machine to access that whenever there is a host network driver. Whenever there is a host network driver directly, it is going to use that. Are you guys clear with my point? Are you guys clear with my point? How to use bridge driver, how to use host driver? Clear, guys? Yeah. So please practice this network drivers concept. So tomorrow we are going to discuss related to Macmillan network driver, how to create Macmillan network driver, because it is you going to simplify the communication between the containers. So in tomorrow's session, I will tell you how to work with this Macmillan driver. Once it is done, then we are going to discuss about Docker Swarm. So tomorrow we are going to learn about Docker Swarm concept. Once the Docker Swarm is completed, then we can start with our Kubernetes concept. Docker Swarm is our last topic in the Docker. I'm going to upload this class notes, guys. So I want all of you to practice it before coming to tomorrow's session. Thank you, guys. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye. Good night. I'm updating the class notes in the portal. Please practice it before coming to tomorrow's session.